Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. How do Quebecers feel about energy supply and security? You may think you know, but the Montreal Economic Institute has done some interesting research. Here to discuss the findings is Renaud Brossard. He is the Senior Director of Communications at the MEI. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
I guess, first of all, can you tell us about the poll that you conducted and why you conducted it?
Well, we asked Quebecers and Canadians more broadly, how do you feel about energy? Sort of as you mentioned in the intro, and the reasons why is pretty simple. We have this narrative in Quebec media that sort of assumes that Quebecers don't want energy development, they're against pipelines, they're against exports, and we were wondering if that was true. So we conducted the poll and found out that it's a slightly different picture. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, and we will get into that. I want to sort of paint the picture, firstly, just of the environment. So Quebec recently had a general election in the last year or so. Was that one of the big issues? Was pipelines and energy transition, those kinds of things?
It was certainly one of the issue. Like, of course, obviously this year the big issue in everyone's mind has been inflation, but energy has been one of the main drivers of inflation. I mean, everybody remembers seeing gas over $2 last May. It hurt people's wallet and definitely it affected them. But it also comes at a time when last April the government of Quebec under Premier Legault banned oil and gas exploration projects in the province. After a couple of years of moratorium, they just outright banned it now. During the election, one of the issues that came up was an LNG export pipeline project that was proposed to go from Northern Ontario all the way to Saguenay in Quebec so that it could reach European markets. It was one of the election issues. Fortunately, the Premier and the Minister of the Economy put the last nails in the project's coffin, saying there was no social acceptability. So to your point, it's sort of why we were wondering about these questions. We just want to make sure that when the Premier tells us there's no social acceptability, we wanted to check that was true.
Okay, let's start talking about your findings. What did you find as a result of your research?
Well, the findings are not actually that surprising. Quebecers are actually a lot more in favor of energy development than what people think. And the reason's pretty simple. I mean, we've seen what it did for Alberta and Saskatchewan. We've seen that those two provinces are much wealthier now than they were before oil and gas was found. We've seen that people are better paid, people can find good jobs. So in terms of local energy development, we have, say, 54% of Quebecers that say that they want to be able to buy local, made in Quebec oil instead of relying solely on imports. Quebecers are also very open to Western Canadian oil. If they can't get it from Quebec, we much prefer if we can get it from Western Canada, where we know how it's produced, we know what environmental regulations are around it, than to get it from anywhere else around the world. And of course, with the whole Russia and Ukraine context, there's about 60% of Quebecers that want to exploit local natural gas so that we can help our allies in Europe and replace Russian natural gas.
Do you think that the war in Ukraine had an impact on some of the findings that you had?
It certainly did. This is not the first year we're conducting such a survey, and every year we said there was a lot more support for development than against. But this year, the war in Ukraine definitely helped firm up that support. And I think people understand that Russia's budget, a decent part of Russia's budget, comes from its oil and gas production and its exports to Europe, but also to Asian countries. And if we can help Ukraine defend its sovereignty by removing some of that defense money or some of those resource revenues that Russia gets, and get those resource revenues here in Quebec and in Canada, I think most people see that as something to be in favor of.
And has there been any reaction from the Quebec government at all from what you've seen?
Unfortunately, no. The Quebec government is still claiming that there's no social acceptability. They're still claiming that Quebecers don't want to do these things, even though, like I mentioned, the numbers show that Quebecers are very open to it. There is still very much debate. And sure, the opposition to some of those projects is stronger in Quebec than it is elsewhere. Like that LNG export project called GNL Quebec in Saguenay. About 30% of Quebecers are against. But then if you look at the number of people for it, you've got 53% of people for it.
We're going to have to take a brief break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Renaud Brossard. He is the Senior Director of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute, talking about basically Canadian and Quebec energy needs and attitudes. Please continue with your point from before the break there.
Well, absolutely. So as I mentioned, there's the opposition to some energy projects is stronger in Quebec. Like I was talking about GNL Quebec, the product in Saguenay for LNG exports, got about 30% of Quebecers that are against it, which is more than in the rest of the country. But when you look at those in favor, you get 53% of Quebecers in favor. So when the premier tells us there's no social acceptability, we're not exactly sure where he gets his numbers from.
Right.
But that's definitely not what we're seeing in when we poll people in the field.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit more about this. There was a liquefied natural gas project in Quebec, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that project and what its status is.
Well, unfortunately, the project right now is dead in the water. The Minister of the Economy, who's also now the Energy Minister, said in Sharm el-Sheikh during COP27 that the project as it stands in its current form is dead. But of course, if the promoter comes back and proposes something different, it might be back on the table. But we're talking about a LNG export project that would have involved a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline between Northern Ontario and the region of Saguenay in Quebec to get our resources to tidewater, and then a liquefaction plant. So this was going to be a $14 billion private investment, the largest in the province's history. And people in the region of Saguenay were very, very much in favor of it. We're talking about like nearly 80% support. People more broadly in Quebec, as we've seen through our survey, were in favor of it as well. But unfortunately, the government chose not to listen to the Quebecers and to listen to a couple of special interest groups that were against it.
Right. And so I guess based on your research, that really shouldn't have been a popular decision because Quebecers are looking for locally supplied energy. Is that right?
Absolutely. And once again, when Quebecers have a choice, when we ask them, they want to be able to purchase made in Quebec energy. If that's not possible, then they will go for Western Canadian energy. And if that's not possible, then they'll import it from elsewhere. But people do see that if we have the resources here, why not exploit them? Why not keep that money in the province instead of buying from foreign sources of energy?
Right. So let's just switch topics slightly. I believe you've done some research on how attitudes towards raising taxes to fight climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. This is one of those questions which we ask all Canadians, because as we know, the carbon tax is going to go up once again this year. And in the context of high inflation, I think nobody's really surprised when we say that most Canadians either don't want to, but also can't afford to pay higher taxes to fight climate change. We had about 60% of respondents nationwide say that they're either not able to afford it or they don't want to. And even when we look at those that say that they're willing to pay some extra taxes, the amount of extra taxes they're willing to pay has been going down for a couple of years. Once again, as high inflation was starting to get hold in 2021 and then got hold in 2022, people felt the impact in their wallets and they're just not able to contribute as much.
So would it be safe to say that people have kind of reached the end of the line when it comes to increased carbon tax? They don't want to see any more of that as a solution to fighting climate change?
I think that's what we're seeing now, definitely. Once again, if you've got 60% of Canadians say that they either can't or don't want to pay higher taxes, you can clearly tell that there's a shift in the population that is not as popular as the true liberals seem to think. And even when you look at those that still believe in those solutions, that still want to pay more into those solutions, when you ask them how much they're willing to pay, that number has been going down for years and years and years. So clearly, it's not the same level of consensus as the federal government seems to believe it is.
Right. And yet it seems to be the policy to keep increasing those taxes.
Unfortunately, it seems like it is, and I mean, we've seen some reports about the impact it does have. Like we've had high inflation this year. One reason was that energy was getting a lot more expensive. Price increases were very, very high, and of course, one of those components that increased the cost of energy is, of course, the carbon tax going on.
We're going to continue our discussion with our guest, Mr. Renaud Brossard, Senior Director of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with Renaud Brossard, Senior Communications Director at the Montreal Economic Institute. Renaud, just going back to Quebec for a second, obviously one of the elephants in the room, I guess, is Hydro-Quebec. Any thoughts about where they sort of fit into renewables and taxes and sort of attitudes in Quebec?
Well, I know right now there's a lot of concern because our new energy minister has alluded to the fact that Quebecers simply don't have as much energy as they used to have. For a number of years, we had huge energy surpluses with Hydro-Quebec. We're trying to sell them to the US. We've been trying to sell them to other provinces. Now it looks like with the added stress in our grid coming from electric cars, coming from other sources, is rapidly getting rid of those surpluses. So much so that our Minister of Energy is talking about energy sobriety. So of course people are concerned with that because we've been used for years to have very cheap electricity prices, to have plentiful electricity. So having to make those decisions to cut back is certainly not something people wanted to hear this year or expected to hear.
Yeah, that must be completely new for Quebecers. I mean, it was a point of pride for Quebecers that they had very low energy costs through hydroelectric being the prime example. So this idea of energy, I actually hadn't heard the term before, energy sobriety. It sounds like another fancy term for rationing, as an example. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about that debate that's going on in Quebec right now.
Well, right now, it's once again, it's the Minister of Energy that has sort of coined this term, or borrowed this term from France, actually, but started talking about it a little bit after the election. Unsurprisingly, they didn't really want to talk about that when people were going to the polls. But he has started to talk about it, and there's a couple of things to consider. One of them is that Quebec is trying to get more electric cars on the road, and these are adding extra stress to the grid. There's the fact that we have more and more electrical products in our houses, but also, and I think this is sort of the elephant in the room, there's the fact that our contract for very, very cheap electricity from Newfoundland is coming due in 2040. And we're not sure that Newfoundland is going to want to renew the contract. And if that contract doesn't get renewed, it's a decent amount of, I think something like 15% of Hydro-Quebec's total power that comes from it. So there's going to be a need for new dams, there's going to be a need for new forms of power plants, or there's going to be a need for people to get back. So it's definitely a new situation for Quebec. It'll be interesting to see whether or not Hydro starts the Blossom project. If it can sign a new deal with Newfoundland, it'll be very interesting to see that. But otherwise, it'll mean a lot of people making some very hard sacrifices.
Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy in Newfoundland and Labrador over that contract with Quebec. From their point of view, selling their birthright at a fairly cheap price. So a lot of these issues are starting to bubble up and to be part of the province-wide debate now. Is that right?
They absolutely are, and it's also a decent part of it is also in terms of what's going to happen for industrial development and for all the jobs that are associated with it. Quebec has a decently large aluminum sector, in no small part thanks to the fact that we have very affordable hydro. Once that's gone, it's not sure that those aluminum plants are going to stay. There's also some the province now looking at reducing the amount of new projects it's approving, or at least the hydro corporation is looking at saying no to some additional industrial development project, which has an impact in terms of job creation, in terms of the raises that people can expect to get, in terms of our broader economy.
So do you see there be an increasing willingness to look at fossil fuels even as a transition method for the next decade or two? Is that becoming part of the public debate in Montreal and Quebec?
I mean, it might. I think at this point we're not seeing it yet.
Okay.
But what we're seeing though is that at the very least, people do recognize that there is still a need for those fuels. And let's be frank, like despite Quebec banning oil and gas exploration and exploitation, we still consume about 360,000 barrels of oil every day. So we still need to have those resources. And once again, people know that if we are to consume those resources, it's much better, much more environmentally friendly if we can get them locally than if we have to bring them in by ship from God knows where, basically.
We're going to continue our discussion with Renaud Brossard at the Montreal Economic Institute after this break. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here with Renaud Brossard, who is the Senior Director of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute. Renaud, just want to now bring this back to the federal government's stance on renewables. There's a lot of debate going on, obviously, not only just on the carbon tax, but on the broader strategy. I'd love to know what your conclusions are based on the research that you have done about that strategy.
In terms of renewable development, we don't have any data on that, unfortunately. What we do have, though, is that when it comes to Canadian energy, Canadian resources, Canadians, I think, overwhelmingly realize that the world is much better with Canadian energy. It's much better when we can get that resource development money, when we know the environmental regulations start being applied to energy development. Honestly, in terms of renewable, we don't have that data on the survey, unfortunately. It was more focused on current Canadian energy production and what we can export.
Right. But we are also getting that debate about the current production. There's a hot debate going on between the province of Alberta right now and the federal government over what's being called a just transition, I suppose, to renewables. And Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta taking exception to that. Does Montreal Economic Institute, do you have a point of view on any of that that's going on?
Honestly, it's not a situation we have looked much into at the moment. We're still very much focused on Quebec, but I gotta admit, as a Quebecer, I always take issue when the federal government comes in and tries to tell a province what to do. And I think, at least from what we can tell from that survey, people are not as opposed to energy development as the feds, but it's like, once again, Quebec doesn't have, right now, it's illegal to exploit an oil and gas, to do some oil and gas extraction in Quebec. But Quebecers want to do it. They know that they need to have that sort of supply. They need to be able to supply to meet their own energy needs. And at the same time, we recognize that there's a demand for this oil and gas, and that we'd be fools not to make any money with it. And I think it's fair to extrapolate that most Quebecers would feel the same about other Canadian provinces. And the fact that we're much more open to having Western Canadian oil than from having it from the U.S. or from other countries in the world means that we very much want that development to happen in Canada much more than everywhere else. And let's be frank, it's very clear that there is a market for Canadian energy. Last August, the German Chancellor was in Ottawa pleading to be able to get more natural gas. Just this month now, actually, just last week, the Prime Minister of Japan was in Ottawa pleading for more natural gas. So the world wants more Canadian energy, and I mean, we'd be fool to leave it to the ground and say no to the billions of dollars that would come with it.
Yeah, no, this is a common refrain on Boom and Bust here about about Germany and now Japan wanting our product, natural gas, which is a cleaner fuel than coal and some of the other options available. And the Prime Minister saying that for some reason that there's no business case. So I'd love to know, do you think that as a result of your findings, we've got about a minute left, but as a result of your findings, Quebecers are going to be more outspoken about these issues?
I'm not sure if they're going to be more outspoken, but I think it's more of a silent majority case because we've noticed those numbers for years. It's not the first time we're polling, and every single year, Quebecers are much more in favor of developing than they are opposed to developing. So I think it's just a matter of a silent majority that is struggling to be heard in the current media narrative and media landscape in the province, fortunately.
Well, we wish you every success in your continued research. Montreal Economic Institute is a very well-known think tank and doing a lot of excellent research in some of these areas that are sometimes ignored by the mainstream media or ignored by governments as well. So congratulations on the work that you're doing and best of luck in the future.
Well, thank you, sir, and thanks for having us.
For sure. Thank you. Would like to thank Renaud Brossard, again, Senior Director of Communications for Montreal Economic Institute, for being on the program today. Very interesting polling results in the province of Quebec that kind of blows up some theories that Quebecers are always against non-renewable energy security. So we'll continue to follow this story. Thanks for watching today.